I've been an Agile coach for the past 6 years, and really most of what I do is just get people in a room together to have a conversation so they can work out their problems with a little bit of help. And the biggest challenge that I see every day in these conversations is people getting mixed up about their terms. And the more I think about it, the more I think that confusion around these two terms, complicated and complex, they are at the root of most of our professional and personal problems. Because if you are dealing with one kind of situation, but you try to apply the solution designed for a different kind of solution, then not only is it not going to work, but you're going to absolutely drive yourself nuts wondering why things aren't getting any better. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video today. What is the difference between these two things? What kind of solutions work best? And how you can protect yourself and your team against using the wrong one. So let's start by talking about what these two things have in common. They are both what we would call high variable domains, which means that they both consist of lots of little pieces, lots of little elements that all connect and all relate to one another. And if you change or alter one of those elements, it's going to have an impact on the other elements. And the important thing here is that in both cases, you have a lot. You've got a lot of these variables. If you didn't have a lot of these variables, we'd be dealing with a simple situation. And simple situations, they're simpler. We probably wouldn't need a whole video for it. So if they're both high variable domains, what's the difference between them? Well, the big difference is that complicated systems describe what we call highly ordered domains, which means that while they do have lots and lots of little variables and they all interact with one another, we have a very, very high level of knowledge about those variables and how they interact with one another. A great example of something that is complicated would be something like a car engine. Now, car engines have lots and lots of pieces, and all of these pieces connect to one another. And if one piece breaks, it can affect another one, and if you change one, it's going to have an impact on the whole system. But the important thing is we know all of the pieces of the engine. We know how they work, we know how they connect to one another, and it's this level of knowledge of the whole system that really defines something that is complicated. Because if we know so much about the system, if we know so much about the engine, all of the pieces and how they work, then we can predict what will happen if we have to change something about the engine. Let's think about something really, really simple. Just the cap on the oil pan. Now there's a pan at the bottom of the engine. It holds all the oil in. You need oil to keep the engine lubricated so the engine stays cool, otherwise it'll seize up. And what you do is you have that cap on the bottom, you unscrew the cap, and the dirty oil comes out. This is how they change oil in cars. What if you didn't have the right cap though? What if you wanted to redesign it? What if for some reason the one that you had broke and you had another cap? You had to use something that wasn't quite the right size. It was just a little bit bigger. Yeah, so you know what's going to happen, don't you? We can predict what's going to happen. In fact, we can predict really, really well what's going to happen. If you put a cap on that plug that's just a little bit too big, well, it's going to leave a gap. And if there's a gap, that means the oil is going to drip out. And the longer you run the engine, the more and more the oil is going to drip. And then you're going to be out of oil and the engine is going to seize up. And the thing about complicated systems, something like an engine, where we really, really understand, we know all of the pieces. And yeah, there's lots of pieces. There's lots and lots of pieces to a car engine. But we know what they all are, and we know how they all work, and we know how, like, the circumference around the threads of the cap, we know all of that stuff. And so when we propose a design change, we know what's going to happen. We can predict really, really well what's going to happen. And that's the defining feature of a complicated system. So if that's what complicated is, how about complex? Well, if the complicated domain is one where everything is really, really well known, we understand all of those pieces and all of the relationships between all of them. A complex domain is, we don't know nothing. Okay, if we knew nothing, that would be chaos. Chaos is a whole other thing. But things that are complex, let's call it, for our purposes, low to medium level of knowledge. And even here you can see where the difficulty and the challenges of talking about this come into play. Because different domains, different systems that we're talking about, that lack of knowledge, it could come in different ways. Maybe we don't know all of the variables in the system. Maybe there's dark matter floating out there. Something is affecting this, but we just flat out don't know what it is. Or maybe we know all of the variables, but we're not really sure how they interact. If you push them or pull them or change them in some way, we don't really know what they're going to do. They're not really reliable. Or even it's just, we might even have the variables. We might understand how each one of them works, but we're not really clear on how, if you change one, how does it affect all of the others? Now, if a complicated system is best described as a car engine, then a complex system would best be described as the human body. Yeah, and I think you can start to see the differences between the two. Both have lots of variables, lots of pieces, lots of interaction between all of them, but there is just so much we don't know about the human body, and that makes it really hard for us to figure out what to do with ourselves. I mean, think about it this way. What is the most banal, what's the most basic kind of advice that you could give someone? What is the thing that we can all agree is good for our health? Probably drink more water, right? I think we can all agree on that, right? Whatever we want to argue about, exercise or food or, looking at the sunrise or every morning, anything like that, drink more water. This is good advice. Okay. But let me ask you something. If you started drinking, let's say, 4 more glasses of water every day, do you know what would happen to you? Like specifically, what specifically would happen to you? Can you predict exactly what will happen to you? I don't think you can. I mean, there's a lot of good things that we think we would expect to have happen, but you can't make the same kind of prediction when it comes to your health as it comes to fixing a car engine. If you put the wrong kind of cap on the oil pan on a car engine, I mean, we can sit there with like calipers and diagramming and math, and we can figure out like very, very precisely the rate of flow of oil out of that engine. We can talk about like the heat dynamics and fluid viscosity. You can predict really accurately when the oil is going to drip out of that engine and when it's going to seize up. And it's definitely going to seize up. You know it's definitely going to happen. On the other hand, drinking more water, it's good advice and it's good for us, and we know it's good. It's not going to have a big impact on everybody. Maybe I already drink lots of water. Maybe I don't have the whatever other problems there are that usually are associated with this. On the other hand, some people will have huge benefits from this. Some of us are just not drinking any water at all, and drinking a little bit more will have a big impact on us. And that's really the problem, is when we're trying to figure out what should we do with one of these situations, our expectations, they should be very, very different depending on whether we're dealing with something like a car engine or whether we're dealing with something that's more like your health. Let's talk a little bit more about problem solving and how it's different in these two domains. Now, one of the signs of a very highly ordered or complicated domain is, like I've been saying, we can make these predictions about when you make a change in the system. Not only can you make a prediction, but you can test those predictions, and generally we will get repeatable results. If you decide to change the cap on the oil pan on the engine, you could do it again and again and again and again and again, and the engine is going to burn out at pretty much the same time every single time that you do it. But again, you can't get that kind of predictive power with the complex domain because we just don't understand enough about what we're dealing with. We can all agree that drink more water is generally good advice, but you don't know how much of an impact it's going to have on any one specific person. On the other hand, when it comes to the complex domain, we can still test things, but we're not going to get those very precise results. We're going to get generally good results. We're going to get good advice for us and what we can do, but we're not going to be able to follow that advice and get the same kind of precise cause and effect result that you would get when you go tinkering around with a car engine. This is ultimately the most important difference between these two models. When things are complicated, you are going to want to lean into all of that knowledge that we have about the system. You're going to want to learn about it as much as you can, gather as much of that expertise as you possibly can, or you can outsource it. You can go find somebody else, you can bring them in, and you can listen to them. Now, furthermore, because these systems are so well known and they're so reliable and repeatable, experts are going to be able to use something called best practices. Yeah, it is recognized as a best practice because experts in the past have tried these things so many times and they've gotten so many repeatable results that they are able to declare that one method is definitively the best way to handle a situation. And yes, before you ask, expertise can sometimes be short-lived. I mean, car engines have advanced a lot over the years, and the best way to replace the oil on an engine from 30 years ago, it might not be the same way it is today, but all things considered, when we're looking at something that's complicated, you want to really rely on that expertise, and they can bring you the best practices for dealing with your problems. But things aren't so clear-cut when it comes to complex systems. Since we don't understand how the systems work as well as we would do if they were complicated, we can't really collectively agree on best practices, and so instead the best we're going to be able to hope for are good practices. You're probably already familiar with good practices, except we usually call them things like principles. They are rules or kinds of guidance that history has shown us will generally produce good results for us, even if there are plenty of times where it doesn't work out, at least not immediately. And this part here is where things start to get really interesting. And I've been dealing with this with teams in IT for years, and I've seen it in individuals that I've coached, and I've seen it myself. It's this interesting phenomenon where you see that gap between the problem that you're facing, the thing that you're looking at right now, and that principle, that good practice, that thing you know you should be doing. The connection between those things can often be very thin. We don't see the result immediately. Sometimes you have to do the right thing, a lot. It has to sort of build up before you see results. And that gap between the effort that you put in and the result that you get out, it can fill our brains with uncertainty. And our brains really, really don't like uncertainty. Our brains hate uncertainty so much that they will let themselves be tricked into believing someone when they promise them that they can produce precise results, even when we're dealing with a complex situation, even when there's a lot of variables and there's a lot of risk, a lot of stuff going on. If someone promises them that they will get something done on time, or more often, as I've seen a lot of managers do, the manager brain pushes the person to make that commitment and promise that they will get something done on time. And why do they do this? They do this because fundamentally their brain doesn't like that uncertainty. They don't like that disconnection. They don't like the fact that, sometimes life is just complex, and sometimes we don't have guarantees, and sometimes we just have to do the good practice. We just have to do the thing that we understand is the best way to operate. It's not perfect. It's not going to deliver. We can't guarantee you results, but this is just the best that we have right now, and we're going to see how it goes. But our brains don't want to hear that, and so they trick themselves into thinking that there is certainty. They trick themselves, and again, they push their underlings into making commitments to them when they really shouldn't. And this is the problem of mismanaging your solutions. If you are actually in a complex environment, you should just be able to accept the fact that, look, we're going to do our best, but there are no guarantees, and we're going to have to manage it as best we can. Unfortunately, your brain, or your boss's brain, insists on solutions that are more like a complicated problem. And complicated problems are ones where you should be able to be given a precise time that your car's tire rotation and oil change will be complete. So how do we make sense of all this? First, you should know the signs of when you're dealing with a complex system. If there are a lot of unknown elements to what you're dealing with, it's more likely complex than complicated, but even there, it might not always be the case. Recognize that I don't have this knowledge is different from this is unknown. If you can go get the knowledge, if you can go find an expert, if you can go find a source for information that you need to help solve a problem, then you probably are dealing with a complicated situation. But if it's something that is just inherently sort of unknowable or risky, that's when you're probably firmly in the complex camp. Also take into account whether you are reliant on outside forces to get something accomplished. If you are, that's going to lean you way more into the complex camp than complication. Look, you could be the best mechanic in the world, but if you need parts from 3 different vendors and they're not very reliable, you're not going to be able to give a good estimate for when you're going to be able to get the work done. It doesn't matter how much you know, because you have these other people that you're reliant on. We've now added more variables into the system, which is making it inherently more complex and risky to deal with. If you find yourself dealing with a complex situation, you can look for ways to improve the level of order in your system. Now, you may have noticed that there's not a strict, bright line separating complication from complexity. Really, it's just a framework for helping us to understand how well we understand the systems that we're dealing with. But we can use this fact to help us by increasing our order of understanding on the situation we're dealing with. The more you know about a complex system, the more it will start to behave like a complicated one. One piece of advice that I often give teams working on difficult problems is to consider getting more information before they come to a decision. I know a lot of people get shoved into meetings or some kind of conversation around some kind of problem, and they feel like they have to solve it now. They have to come up with a big solution right now based on the information that they have. They only have an hour to get it done. But a lot of times there really is an opportunity to do more research or maybe get clarity on something before you have to make your decision. And I'm mentioning this because it's something I think most people don't even think to ask. They don't even think to say, well, wait a minute, can we get a better answer on this piece? Or can we get a firmer commitment on something? Or can we go interview someone? Can we get something else done? Because the more information you get, the more reliable you're going to be able to make your decision. Another way to increase the order in the system you're dealing with is to cut out any extra variables or factors so you can just work with a smaller and simpler framework. Now, I've worked with lots of teams over the years who get overwhelmed because they're trying to make a decision while thinking about all kinds of inputs and possibilities from multiple outside teams and stakeholders and what all these other people are going to say and what they're going to do. But once we dig in, we realize that the team itself was overthinking a lot of the problem. And ultimately, they were just adding this complexity onto their own plate. It was something they didn't really need to deal with. Now, once they realized this, they were able to clear a lot of that away, and they found themselves in a much simpler decision space. They found it easy to get out of it. Third, you got to recognize perfect solutions are mostly an illusion, and they don't really exist in real life. Instead, what I would recommend is you start to think four-dimensionally about your problem. How is this thing going to be affected through time? Instead of trying to come up with one big solution that's going to fix the whole thing at the start of the problem, come up with some good practices. Come up with some small things that you're willing to try for just a little while. It's not going to solve the whole problem, but just something that you could do for a day or maybe a week, depending on what the problem is. Now, when that little voice in your head starts piping in and saying, oh, but this isn't going to fix everything, you reply, it's not supposed to fix everything. It's just going to make things a little bit better, and then we're going to revisit this in, again, a day, a week, or whatever it is. Whether you can think of this as a coping mechanism, or it's a way to string along short-term solutions into a bigger problem, or it's just a good way to wait for more information to appear that could affect how you're going to solve the problem, I have found this remarkably effective in dealing with complex problems, and I'll tell you this, it is a lot less time-consuming than trying to come up with a perfect plan that doesn't even exist. The last and maybe best piece of advice I have is to just take a deep breath and remind yourself, most of life is complex. There are too many variables for us to properly understand. There are outside events beyond our control. They act upon us all the time. And it's really just our stupid brains keep tricking us into thinking that we have a really good grasp on things all the time, which ironically makes us feel worse when we can't plan things out and do them perfectly. Now, if you find yourself going around and around trying to come up with a perfect solution for a problem, but never getting much closer, it's probably a sign you should just accept a good solution for now and get on with your life. If you like today's video, the like and subscribe buttons are below, and I would really love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What challenges do you have in dealing with making plans or dealing with complicated and complex situations? Now, we've got a few other videos you might be interested to hear, and there's one over here too. But in the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.